arduous even to just have that thought. Just kind of hold it. And then she's at the point now of going like, maybe in a future life, maybe not in this life, maybe. And I'm like, that's cool, that's all right. Like just kind of, you know, Venerable Roger Lama Zopa's attendant, when I was talking to him about it, he said, you know, even, he was quoting some text and he said, even to take one step towards the monastery with the thought in your mind of renunciation and ordination, even just taking one step in that direction, he says, is more merit than offering to all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 3 times in 10 directions. Like even just being attracted to that. And yeah, so I would just kind of hold it and keep creating the cause and keep, you know, making prayers that at some point all the causes and conditions come together. Because for me, I was really glad I waited. Like Lama Zopa could have told me 10 years earlier to do it and I would have done it. But since it was such a shift for me, I've never had an instant's regret, never the slightest instant of second thought ever. And I think if I had rushed or pushed or done it because I thought I should or something, if I hadn't waited for that internal, it was just this huge internal shift. It was almost like I could feel these gears turning, going chunk, and then it was like they were in a different configuration, and then there was like no question. So like that.
I kind of feel similar, because I mean I'm young, I'm 22, but I mean like
yeah.
I just feel like such a strong pull towards it.
Yeah,
yeah. I don't know if it's something I should rush into. I mean I'm trying to like figure out. I just don't even know.
Yeah, well, you know, a lot of lamas, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has certain criteria, and I think it's to help prevent people from rushing in a way they're going to regret later. And one of the criteria is you have to have taken refuge for at least, I think for His Holiness criteria, which Lama Zopa also accepts, 5 years. You know, so it's, and I know people who are interested, but they just took refuge last year or something, so I say, okay, well, you can't really even do it yet, just kind of work towards that. And then I think one of the criteria, it keeps changing, but I think one of them is to have taken and been keeping lay vows for at least like 2 years. So it's sort of progressive, because in the old days, we would go to India and Nepal and people would take one 10-day class and decided they were going to get ordained at the end of their intro class or something. And that happened all the time. And a lot of times then they go back to their country, they really had no idea what they were doing, and they'd freak out. I mean, it's hard, especially in the West. I don't find it hard, but the ways that it's hard for people, feeling like a Martian and having people stare at you, those kind of things don't bother me at all, you know, and I'm pretty independent-minded and all of that, so, you know, it doesn't, but for a lot of people it can be challenging. It's easy when you're in India and Nepal and you're studying and you're surrounded in that environment and it's like so supportive, and then you come back to Boston and it's like, oh my God, what about, you know, so that happened a lot, especially in the beginning. So they sort of caution people to kind of do it, you know, one step at a time a little bit more. Yeah, yeah. So that, yeah.
I find, I've been here as a subject for 3.5 years.
Yeah.
Actually 3.5 years ago, 4 years ago, I met His Holiness here. Or saw him here, I can't say I met him. But I find that the strong feeling, sense of this is right for me, the aspiration that I feel that's so consistent over that period of time, has really helped to ground, well, I've been balancing that strong feeling with being in the world. And I think without having been in the world, I would have just kind of gone into this, this in my head.
Yeah.
And not had been really grounded. So for me to be still in the community, in a married life, at work, with my aspiration is what's making the practice real for me.
Good, yeah.
So I think that's important to spend the time.
Sure.
I didn't know what 3.5 years was going to feel like. I don't know what 5 years is going to feel like.
Yeah.
But I find that there are changes all along the way.
That's right, yeah.
Reality checks.
Yeah. It's true. Yeah, good. All right. Shall we carry on with Bodhisattva Vows? So we were up to proclaiming false realizations of voidness. And that's pretty obvious. You just don't want to, claim things falsely about your realizations, especially out of any kind of a wish for respect, material offerings. And it kind of goes along with the first vow about praising yourself for respect and offerings. That could be a specific way that you would do that, except it also involves lying about your attainments. Praising yourself even in realistic ways to get offerings and respect is breaking the first one. But especially like falsely claiming to be an Arya and have a direct realization of emptiness is specific instance of that in terms of breaking this vow. And then the next one, to accept the property of the three jewels. So we had another one that was about stealing the property of the three jewels, right? And then this one is saying even to accept property taken or stolen from the three jewels. And the original meaning of this one was, again, about people in power imposing fines on monastics that didn't have their own personal property. So in order to pay the fine, they had to take the possessions of the three jewels in order to pay the fine. This must have happened historically with some king or something like that. So the fines had to be taken by taking the property that belonged to the temple or the monastery or so forth and confiscate it in order to pay the fine. But I think we can think of anything, if you're ever in a condition that you know that somebody's giving you something that is actually taken from something that was offered to the three jewels or the property of the three jewels. Hopefully we wouldn't be, that wouldn't come up for us much. That wouldn't be one of those ones that we would be in the position of very much. And then the next one too, we don't have to worry about much. Establishing harmful rules. And what this specifically refers to is taking away the possessions of meditators and giving them to people who are studying or people that are doing pujas. For a lot of monasteries, I think historically and also, currently, traditionally, get offerings from lay people for doing pujas and rituals in their houses. Like, for example, in traditional Buddhist countries for New Year, or if, a family wanted to remove the obstacles to their business or something like that, they would invite the monastics to their house to do some sort of a puja or practice, and then they would give offerings after having done that. So this is saying you're the administrator of a monastery, and you're supporting the people who go out and get the offerings for the monastery, but then there's yogis who want to just be meditating, so they're not serving that purpose that sort of gets the offerings in, and you're not supporting them, right? So that's what this one is. Again, sort of a historical example that we don't really have much of a danger of, although there's a Buddhist translator called Alex Berzin. Some of you might have heard of him. Really great translator, and he's got a great website called Berzin Archives, like a lot of great information on it, including a good transcript of Bodhisattva Vows commentary that he's given. And he mentions in terms of this vow, a modern example, he says, maybe teaching casual private students who can pay high fees and neglecting serious students who can pay us nothing. So that could be an example. Again, gauging your actions to benefit others on the basis of who can pay the highest fees. Spending a lot of time with the rich benefactors, and the poor student who's really serious comes to see you and you blow them off. Something like that. Again, hopefully we wouldn't be in much danger of that, but that would be an example that would be close to this one, and that would be establishing that rule. But classically for this vow, you would need to be like a monastery administrator to really break that one. And then the last one of the 18 root vows, giving up your bodhicitta. So for this one, you need to already have generated at least aspiring bodhicitta, and then you give it up. You personally decide that you don't want to become enlightened to benefit others, either in terms of saying, I'm not going to help all sentient beings, Or you can think, I can't do it, I'm not capable of it. So it's either giving it up in terms of one being that you just like, I'm not going to work to help this person, or a group of beings that you just say, no, I'm not going to work to help them. Or out of a sense of personal discouragement of just going, no, I can't do this. I'm not capable of doing this. And the minute after you've had that thought, if it's really sincere from the depths of your heart, because sometimes like the question that Annette asked last night, can we have a break? Which I thought was a literal that was hilarious. I was thinking about that this morning. There's something about the way she called it out, like, can we have a break? Did you think this? That was, because I looked at the clock and I'm like, we just had a break 15 minutes ago. I'll never forget that. That was so hilarious. So, she was kind of explaining, like, sometimes you're just sort of exhausted. This is like, and by the way, this bodhisattva thing, it's like for many, many, many lifetimes. It's got to be sustainable. It can't be, we've got, in the West, we have this story about the tortoise and the hare, this whole, what is it, Aesop's Fables or something that says, the the hare seems really speedy, but he just kind of burns himself out and has to take a nap. And meanwhile, the tortoise passes him. They have the same story in Tibet. Apparently, it's the louse and the flea. Same story. So we have to be quite steady and persistent, which does mean we need to take a break, and not just to go to the bathroom either. It's like sometimes, we need to rest, we need to take breaks. So this doesn't mean a moment of exhaustion like Annette was talking about, where you're just like, oh my God, I just need a break from this, to kind of revive yourself. This means like from the depths of your heart, you're like, I give up this thing. It's not just, and we might even have a moment of discouragement with a person we're trying to help. I mean, that happens all the time. So it's that momentary thing just on the basis of some experience we've just had. But this is saying, like, from the depths of your heart, you're just like, okay, I've had it. I'm not going to do this helping all sentient beings thing anymore at all, right? So that's what this one is talking about. So questions about that one? Yes?
Okay, it's not about that one.
Okay.
It's actually a definition of a word that I don't know.
Yeah.
It's in number 16. What is a bhikshu?
Oh, that's a fully ordained monk. Yeah. Thank you. I didn't notice that was in, that's a fully ordained monk.
And would they be taking, well, my assumption is that a fully ordained monk has taken on more vows than non-fully.
This one, I mean, really, it should just say monastics, because it really, anybody who's taken monastic vows. I mean, I'm not sure why in here, and that's another thing I'll have to write them and say, you need to correct that. But yeah, so there's different levels of ordination. There's novice ordination, there's full ordination for both monks and nuns. There's also an intermediate level of ordination for nuns only. So taking anything from any of those, but it might have mentioned in the classic text fully ordained monks, but that's not the only object of that. So it would be any monastic, because we're representatives of the third jewel, the Sangha jewel. So stealing anything that belongs to the monastics or a monastic community would fulfill that. But that's what that word means. It's the Sanskrit word for a fully ordained monk. Yeah. Yeah, good. Any other questions about any of that? Yeah.
Bhikshu is specifically just any monastic person?
No, bhikshu means fully ordained monk. Bhikshu specifically refers to is the word for a fully ordained monk.
I've seen the word bhikshuni before, though.
That's a fully ordained nun.
Nun.
Yeah. Okay, so you want to know how you can break these? Or how not to break them. Let's put it like that. Let's frame it that way. So you see on page 10, in the bottom, it says the 4 conditions. So in order to totally break your vows and lose them completely, Except for number 9 and number 18, you need these 4 conditions. Why do you think number 9 and number 18 are exceptions to the rule? Anything jump out about 9 and 18? Yeah, Marianne.
Well, 18 is I don't want to be a bodhisattva anymore, so why even have the vow?
Yeah, you just lost it, right? You've just lost it completely because you've just decided, hey, it's not even indirect. It's totally direct. You've given up your vow. You've given up that whole thing. So who cares about what other conditions are there? It's such a direct throwing in the towel kind of thing. Yeah. What about no?
For number 9, it's almost the same reason.
Because the existence of 3 jewels and denying existence of the law, I mean, that's kind of your basic stuff.
That's right.
So if you want to just throw that out, then what's the...
Well, that's right, because that's the whole foundation for this whole idea. If you decide that you don't believe in enlightenment, you don't believe in future lives, you don't believe the law of cause and effect, so it's not as direct as 18, which is just very directly going, okay, I've had it, I'm not going to do this anymore. But this is rejecting all of the foundational ideas that would make that even possible. So it's just completely undermines the foundation of that bodhisattva kind of shape to your life, right? So that's why these don't involve any extra things, any extra conditions at all. It's like you've just blown it either directly because you're like, I don't want to be a bodhisattva anymore, or indirectly by saying all those things that it's, that idea is kind of predicated on, I'm rejecting now. So the whole thing kind of falls apart. So you've lost it. And Alex Berzin talks about, I like the way he frames it. He says, you've lost the bodhisattva shape to your life, which is just kind of like when you take bodhisattva vows, it's really, meant to kind of shape and frame your life in a really different way and kind of from a different perspective. Not that you're going to be perfect, not that you're going to do all this stuff perfectly all the time, but it's just that kind of overarching sort of aspiration and sort of momentum to your life. So when you do one of these things like give that up completely or give up anything that's based on, you just lost that kind of shape to your life altogether. Yeah, so that sort of makes sense. Now for the other one, oh yeah, Chris.
I was looking for some terminology, just in terms, when you say shape, it's not like an identity, right? We're not, because I made that mistake in my sort of spiritual thing, spiritual materialism is what I've heard.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we can identify as long as we don't cling to that identity. I think we can say, yeah, I'm on board with this. This is what has meaning for me. Yeah, this is really enriching of my life in a way that's actually can be beneficial. Now, overly clinging on to that because like, oh, I don't want to be the other thing anymore, so I'm really going to be this now. That can, maybe over-identification or clinging to that identity. It's just another substitute for strong clinging to another identity. But if you just say, yeah, it's valid for me to really identify as somebody who's, like our identity of being a Buddhist after we've taken refuge, like that sort of is a functional working identity that can be helpful, but the strong grasping onto it, like we were talking last weekend about the kind of the functional ego and then the self-representational ego that has a whole storyline and all these concepts around it, and then the danger there is when it's going well, you feel encouraged by it, and then you do something wrong and you just feel like such an utter failure because you're so clinging on to that identity rather than just saying, yeah, it functions because this is now this new perspective I'm trying to live my life by. But yeah, the strong clinging is always a problem. So I think it's like identifying loosely as sort of a process and a function is okay, but that strong clinging not so good. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Always for all of them, right? So, yeah, good. So there's 4 conditions. There's that scary page of all the sources of the vows. We'll skip over that. Oh, not that one either. So the 4, sometimes we call them binding afflictions, right? Because it means afflictions, mental affliction that needs to be in your mind, to break the vows completely. The first one, failing to regard the action as wrong. And this isn't talking about ignorance about the vows. This says you know what your bodhisattva vows are. You know it's a vow that you've taken, and you just go, well, there's nothing wrong with it. If I break that one, yeah, I know I took that vow, but there's nothing wrong with breaking it. Just disregarding that in the sense that, you know it's a vow, but you just don't think there's anything wrong with having done it. Okay, so that's the first attitude that needs to be in your mind. And then the second one, not abandoning the thought to do it again. Let's say praising yourself to get a good reputation, right? So, praising yourself in a way out of a motivation for, wanting a good reputation. So you do it, you know that you took a bodhisattva vow not to do it, but you go, that's totally okay. I got people to respect me. That was fine to do that. And I'm going to do it again. That worked so well the first time. I'm going to just carry on doing that. That's the second condition. Not abandoning the thought to do it again. Being pleased about doing it. Yeah, that really worked. That was awesome, actually, because, wow, then they really bowed down. And then when I got the envelopes at the end of class, they were so full of offerings. So that was actually great that I, talked about all of my lamas and all the teachings that I've had, because it really worked for me. So I'm happy to do it again, and that was awesome, And having no shame or consideration. So these words mean something very specific. I don't really like the translation shame for the first one, but we're kind of a little bit stuck with it. I prefer to think of it more in terms of your personal integrity. So the first one means you don't have any shame, meaning you don't have any thought that I wouldn't do that just because of who I am. Even if no one would ever know, I would never get caught. I just have a sense of personal integrity that it's just wrong. It doesn't kind of correspond with who I am as a person, so I would never do that. So you don't have that attitude, right? So that's what they're defining as shame, that attitude of sort of integrity, of like, this is not who I am as a person, I would just never do that. Even if nobody would ever find out or know, it's just not me. And then consideration is consideration for other people's opinion. And it doesn't mean being a people pleaser, but what it means is, like, for example, for somebody like me, I'm really obviously a representative. I'm a walking billboard, right, of Buddhism, a Buddhist nun. I was talking to a friend of mine recently who was a Zen monk, a monk in the Zen tradition, and he was talking about how he had been sent off he had lived in a monastery for a really long time, and then he was sent off to start a center in this town, quite a big city actually, and he found he was would walk around in his lay clothes, and then he would maybe go to bars. I mean, it's not breaking a vow in their tradition, because they don't have vows not to drink alcohol and not to have relationships, but he found himself getting into this very worldly life that he didn't really feel comfortable. He was like, well, I'm doing these things, but it just feels really, really uncomfortable. And so we're good friends, and he's been corresponding with me about, wanting to kind of like tighten up things a little bit. And then he said, I first made the decision to start wearing my robes all the time in public, because he said that really changes my behavior. It has an effect on my behavior, because I don't want people to think that a Zen monk is behaving in these ways. And so I said, yeah, it really works, because you're going around and you're a representative of the teaching. So it's not about wanting people to think that you're so great, but just you don't want them to have a wrong view about, Buddhists, because of how you're acting. And so if you're a known Buddhist, that would be that kind of consideration for other people's views. You don't want to break your vows. So if you don't have any of these attitudes and you do one of these 18 things, what do you think just happened? You just lost the plot big time, didn't you? Talk about the Bodhisattva shape to your life. You've just completely lost it. So we say, with those 4 things, you actually break the vow, the Bodhisattva vow, and to restore it, you need to take the vows again. If you ever change your mind and decide you want a Bodhisattva shape to your life, because to do the misdeed with all 4 of those things, wow, you've gotten way off track, right? So if you decide ever to kind of get back on track, you need to retake the vows. Now, you can damage your vow or transgress your vow by in one of two ways. They say a medium level of binding afflictions means you don't have all 4, but you have number 1 and some combination of the other ones, but not all 4. That's medium. You don't think there's anything wrong with it, and either 1 or 2 of the other conditions. That's a medium level of binding afflictions. If you're missing number 1 and you have some combination of the other 3, that's a lesser condition of binding afflictions. So this is the worst one, just failing to regard it as wrong at all. That really damages, right? But if you don't have all 4, you haven't lost your vows completely, you've just damaged them, and you can repair them. It's said for a medium level of binding afflictions, you repair by confessing to 3 other people. Okay, so you choose your Bodhisattva Vows restoration team of 3 Dharma friends. Helpful if they either have the vows themselves or just have some understanding of what you're trying to do in your life. They don't have to have necessarily the Bodhisattva vows, but they have respect for that way of life and just some kind of understanding. You don't want to confess to somebody who's like, great, do it again, that's awesome, now you're finally, becoming a normal person again. That doesn't do much good. So you want to confess to somebody. So the author of the commentary, Geshe Sewang Samdrup, recommends this. Lama Tsongkhapa says if you can't find people to confess to, you can do it by generating strong regret and resolve not to do the action again and purify with the 4 opponent powers, which you're supposed to do anyway, by the way. I mean, always supposed to do purification practice, whether you confess to others or not. But it's so powerful to actually cop to your misdeeds verbally to other people. It's so scary and really, really powerful. So really highly recommended. And I think in places like Kurukulla Center, you guys are so lucky you don't live in the middle of Kansas. It's like, I always use Kansas as the example. I've never even been there but like twice in my life, but it just seems like this devoid of Dharma place to me. I'm probably totally wrong. Probably great Dharma centers in Kansas. But, you've got other people that you have relationships with that you can really kind of support each other in this Bodhisattva activity. So I want to read directly, because I think it's such a good explanation, so I'm going to read a little bit from Alex Berzin's website, his explanation of these 4 binding factors and when are they there, with a real life example that could happen to us, so that we have a better understanding of what they are. So pardon me for just reading to you guys. I don't usually do that, but this is just so good I want to read it in his words. So he says, examples of the 4 binding factors. For example, suppose we do not lend someone one of our books because of attachment to it and miserliness. We see nothing wrong with this. After all, this person might spill coffee on it or not give it back. And he means kind of a Dharma book. So this would be like not sharing the Dharma. That would be that vow of not sharing material things or the Dharma. We've never lent it before and have no intention to change this policy now or in the future, right? Moreover, when we refuse, we're happy about our decision. Lacking moral self-dignity, that's an interesting translation of shame. Lacking moral self-dignity, we're shameless about saying no. We don't care how our refusal reflects on ourselves, despite the fact that as someone supposedly wishing to bring everyone to enlightenment, how could we not be willing to share any source of knowledge we have? Unabashed. We do not care how our refusal reflects on our spiritual teachers or on Buddhism in general, and we have no intention of doing anything to counterbalance our selfish act. If we have all these attitudes when refusing to lend our book, we've definitely lost the Bodhisattva shape to our lives. We've totally fallen down on our Mahayana training and lost all our Bodhisattva vows. On the other hand, if we lack some of these attitudes and do not loan our book, we've merely slackened our efforts to maintain a Bodhisattva shape to our lives. We still have the vows in weakened form. Okay, so then he goes on to the weakened form. He says, transgressing one of the 16 vows with none of the 4 binding factors present does not actually weaken our Bodhisattva vows. It says, for example, we don't lend our book to someone who asks, but we know it's basically wrong. We don't intend to do this as a policy. We're unhappy about saying no. We're concerned about how our refusal reflects on ourselves and on our teachers. We have a valid reason to refuse lending it, such as a pressing need for the book ourselves, or we've already promised it to someone else. Our motivation is not attachment to the book or miserliness. We apologize for not being able to lend it now and explain why, assuring the person we shall lend it as soon as possible. To make up the loss, we offer to share our notes. In this way, we fully maintain the Bodhisattva form to our lives, right? So he's saying, even if you do one of those 16 things, if you don't have any of these attitudes, and in fact, if you have the opposite, like you regret it, you know that it was wrong to do it, you think, oh, I hope I never do that again. All the opposites, you haven't even damaged your Bodhisattva vows at all. That's like super reassuring, isn't it? You know, because again, we're not going to be perfect with all these things right off the bat. It's a training. But even when we do something like that with regret and all of these opposites, then we don't harm our vows at all. We progressively begin to weaken that form and loosen our hold on our vows as we come increasingly under the influence of attachment and miserliness. Please note that maintaining the vow to refrain from not sharing Dharma teachings or any other sources of knowledge does not rid us from attachment or miserliness with our books. It merely keeps us from acting under their influence. So we shouldn't expect that we're not going to have those mental afflictions, but at least it keeps us from really giving in to acting under their influence. We may lend our book, or because of an urgent need, not lend it now, but still be attached to it and basically a miser. Vows, however, help in the struggle to exterminate these disturbing emotions and gain liberation from the problems and the suffering they bring. The stronger these troublemakers are, however, the more difficult it is to exercise self-control, not to let them dictate our behavior. And then he says, we're progressively more dominated by attachment and miserliness, and our vows are progressively weaker when, in not lending the book, we know it's wrong to do so, but hold any one, two, or all 3 of the other binding factors. So if you're missing this one, but have one of the other ones, you know, you've weakened your vows. And then he says, even a weaker level of maintaining this shape in our lives begin when we don't acknowledge it's wrong in refusing to lend the book and add 1 or 2 of the other binding factors. We're now fully under the sway of attachment and miserliness. Okay, so you can kind of see. And that's a good example of how we can look at these different factors in our lives around that example of not lending the Dharma book. So these things are meant to be challenging, but not impossible. And to break your vows completely. I mean, we're damaging them all the time. And right before we came back, I was talking to someone and just saying, when we take refuge and lay vows, we usually take them once unless we've completely lost them, because they're pretty easy to keep. It's pretty easy to keep that without really damaging or losing, unless you've broken one of your lay vows or just given up your refuge completely. You don't usually retake those. However, Bodhisattva vows are a different story, and we retake those all the time because it's quite possible that we're weakening them a lot, hopefully not totally breaking and losing them, but even when we weaken them, it can reinforce to take them over and over and over again. So one of the things is, if you've taken Bodhisattva vows and they're being given again by a preceptor that you have respect for, you need to have a certain respectful relationship with the person giving the vows. We're encouraged to renew as much as possible. And like I said yesterday, even at the time of death, we try and renew our vows as much as possible, so we're taking them into the next life kind of clean and fresh. There were some questions over here. Yeah.
I'm thinking if you get to the point when you're taking the Bodhisattva vows,
Yeah.
You'd be at a certain level where you're really committed and you're going to make these vows in your life. I'm just wondering, what would cause you to have a transgression where you would have 4 afflictions? I understand 1 or 2.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, what could occur in your life where all
Where you'd be like, so.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting because last weekend when we were looking at I can't remember if I mentioned this, when we were looking at the 12 links, right? And that place between feeling and craving. And I remember once we were asking my teacher, Kirti Sanchar Rinpoche, we're asking about free will, which means something completely different in Christianity, all about God. But it's just this thing of where's the choice point? If our karmic imprints give us these propensities in our mind, how do we ever shift or change? And I remember he was saying, well, no, we have wisdom. We can choose a different direction. You use your wisdom here. And then he said, but at that point in the 12 links between feeling and craving, he goes, if your mental affliction is strong enough, it's almost as if you don't have a choice. So I think in certain circumstances, even with that, as you've said, you've taken on this, you still aspire for that, still, because we're still suffering sentient beings under the control of karma and delusions and all of that, there could be a chance that your mental afflictions are so incredibly strong that they just override. When I think of my own path, there's times that I've totally known I shouldn't do something, and it's like, don't do it, you're doing it. It's like the mental affliction, even though part of your mind just knows better, you're still under the sway of it. So maybe not with the Dharma book. I think it's a great example because it's so practical and real, but what if there was something else that out of your total attachment, or you just blow it, really, I could see that would happen if it was a really, really strong affliction. So, I'm kind of trying to think of example, but I think that would be the principle is, it could be that because of the object and because of the situation, you're still so under the sway of the mental affliction. Yeah. Well, that's why it's really hard to break them completely. It's so reassuring, easy to damage them in some way, but it actually is really quite hard. Because sometimes what happens is, I remember driving to a teaching with a friend of mine in Canada once, and we were going to see this Lama at Tupten Chodron's place in Washington State, north of Spokane, and from where we lived in central British Columbia, it was like a 2-day road trip. And I remember when we got there, the Lama who I know, he's like, hi, what are you doing here? He's like, where are you living right now? And I told him, and he said, how far away is that? And I go, oh, it's a 2-day drive. And he was like so shocked that I'd spent 2 days. Anyway, the Lama was giving Bodhisattva vows, and I was driving along with my friend, and she said, she's kind of a new student, and she goes, oh, I've read the list of Bodhisattva vows, because she just read the 1-line summary without studying any of this stuff and the exceptions and the 4 binding afflictions. She's like, oh, I could never take those because they're so easy to break. And then was like, well, no, they're not easy to break. It might seem that they're easy to transgress and you'd have a tendency. So that's why you need to really get good teaching, because I notice sometimes people will just read like the short summary that you find sometimes that's supposed to just remind us of this weekend course. You know, you're only supposed to kind of read the one-liners if you know the fine print and you've studied the commentaries, because otherwise it'll just freak you out. You're like, praise myself and, you know, diss others, and you're like, I do that all the time, but it's like out of a wish for gain and material, you know. So it sort of can be quite daunting, but it's really hard. I mean, that's the reassuring part. When you really study like this, you go, well, gosh, I don't have to wait to be perfect to take the Bodhisattva vows, because it really is quite hard. I can use them as these training guidelines, and I might still mess up, but not so bad, because it's actually really hard to blow it so completely. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you had a question.
Is that true also, though, for the 5 acts of immediate retribution? Like if you kill a parent, you can, like, it seems...
Oh, you mean with the 4 binding afflictions? Yeah, you know, yeah. I mean, if you did that after you had your Bodhisattva vows, right? And you had no regret about having done that at all, and all of those 4 binding afflictions.
You said that the first of the 4 is the worst one, right?
Yeah.
But it seems like having any of those other ones with those 5 acts still, in the context of your saying that it's really hard to, you know, you can transgress, but to break them, that still wouldn't be considered breaking them, even if, you know, you couldn't abandon the thought of doing it again.
You mean if you do one of the 5 heinous crimes without all 4 of those, have you lost your Bodhisattva vows? No, the way it's explained, it's just the 9th one and the 18th one. I mean, it's heavy negativity. Like, that's why they're called the 5 crimes of immediate retribution. But it's in terms of that bodhisattva. And that's really interesting. And nobody's asked that question. And now that I'm thinking about it, it's like, wow, that's really interesting that, like, you could still even do those without all 4 of these things, and you could still kind of have that bodhisattva. Yeah, that's interesting. But that's the way it's explained. It's explained just for the 9th and 18th, they're automatic. Because I think those go so, even though those things are so horrible, the 9th and 18th just go so directly against the bodhisattva frame of mind, you know, whereas those are so heavy, but not necessarily directly contrary to that bodhisattva frame of mind. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I hadn't really thought about these 4 binding afflictions in terms of those 5 heinous crimes, and all of it kind of feels really heavy, doesn't it? You know, those compared to the other ones, for sure. Especially if you do any of those things after taking Bodhisattva vows. Yeah, good question. You always ask these really good, hard questions. Thank you. Makes me think. Everybody's looking super sleepy. I think we just need a little caffeine break. What do you think? Everybody's nodding off. This is really always hard right after lunch, especially when the lunch break is short. So let's have a little 10-minute revival here. Then we'll come back and start the secondary vows. We've got 46 of them to go. We will be okay. But those are kind of interesting because they're not as sort of unambiguous as the root ones, so sometimes provocative of quite a lot of conversation. So let's have a cup of tea. Did we get any more coffee? No. Okay, I was going to say, people look like they need coffee right now. Yeah, all right. We'll have some serious coffee. That's fine. We might need 15 minutes though, right? How far away is it where you need to go? Let's take 15. We'll say 2:30 or whenever we're able to refill our coffee cups. Everybody needs some. Thank you for your bodhisattva activity. necessary, but it's just kind of nice when we have a little time, then we can have these conversations and things. Yes? Yeah.
I mean, not I'm going to take the vow, but I just feel like I may not be ready for it because I don't get my, I still don't know, like, I think I'm a little, it's like, what happens if I'm with my friend and like my friend was opening a bottle of red wine, that can we even drink that wine?
Yeah. And those are the lay vows, right? So one of the lay vows is not to take any intoxicants. And so, yeah, for a lot of people, like, their social life really revolves around just, having a glass of wine or something like that. Different teachers give that vow in different ways. Some say, oh, a glass of wine on a social occasion is okay. My teacher, when I took that vow, said, not even a drop, because he said, alcohol reduces your heedfulness, and then after one glass, your heedfulness is already reduced enough that you go, oh, the second glass will be fine. Then by the end of the second glass, your heedfulness is like gone to, hell. And then, so he said very strictly, some teachers say you can take whichever one of the lay vows that you feel really committed to keeping. You don't have to take all 5. So the one that most people skip is the intoxicants. When I give lay vows, I often give them in prison, and then I say, repeat after me for whichever vow that you're going to take. Usually everybody's repeating after me when I go killing, stealing. There's a few less for sexual misconduct. Lying, it drops off considerably, and then one person's chanting along with me when it comes to no intoxicants. So that's one option too, is to take whichever one. Some lamas say all or nothing, you have to take all 5 or not. But it's really important, like I was saying before, to at least have a serious attitude, thinking, okay, I'm not going to be perfect, but I'm going to at least really be serious about this and do my best, and be serious about taking it before we actually take them as a vow. And then it's good to experiment a little bit before that and just say, maybe I'll just try and see how I do, and then if I do really well and it seems easy, then I can take it as a vow. Yeah, so those are the 5 lay vows are not killing, not stealing, not engaging in sexual misconduct, not lying, and not indulging in intoxicants, so anything that would alter your state of mind. So that's separate. Those are pratimoksha, or individual liberation vows, so that's separate. Well, there's a way that you can take vows for 24 hours, but those would be lifetime lay vows, but there are vows that you can take that we sometimes take for special practice days that we'll just take for 24 hours at a time. Yeah. Did Chris go? Did anybody know what happened to Chris? Okay, I just noticed he's missing, but maybe he had to go. Yeah.
For root vow 8, I'm just wondering, how would you know if you killed an arhat?
Yeah, right. Not necessarily would you know. So probably better not to kill anybody. Yeah. But if whoever you killed weren't an arhat, it would be bad enough, but even worse if it were actually an arhat. But yeah, unless you were at a high level of realization, you wouldn't really know that it was an arhat. Yeah, interesting. Maybe they did, but they probably wouldn't have because of the whole humility thing, right? So chances are they might not have done it. All right, so let's launch into the 46 secondary vows, now that we've laid a great framework with the root vows. And so the 46 secondary vows, you can restore these by confessing to another person. So this whole thing of the 4 binding afflictions, still good to keep kind of aware of if these are in your mind. But for the secondary ones, no matter how many of those are present, you can't lose your vows. For the secondary ones, no matter what your state of mind. I mean, again, not terrific to have any of these in your mind at all, but these only really apply to the root vows and breaking and losing completely your Bodhisattva vows. So again, keep them in mind. I mean, not great to just go, oh, I don't care and I'll do it again and it was great that I did it and I don't care what anyone thinks. Obviously, that's heavy, but not in terms of actually losing the vows. So let's look at these. Now you can break these in an afflicted way or a non-afflicted way. And so for most of the secondary ones, as we see, you can transgress them either with a mind filled with some kind of mental affliction, particularly things like anger, pride, jealousy, or in a non-afflicted way. And that just means you don't keep it, but it's just out of laziness or carelessness and not anger, jealousy, pride, something like that. So just, you can't be bothered, or you're lazy, or you're careless. Again, not great, but there's a difference in kind of degree between whether your mind is filled with afflictions or not. So the first 7 vows, this is when we get into the vows that relate to the 6 perfections. And I know a lot of you said you're familiar with the 6 perfections. So the first 7 of vows go against the perfection of giving, or the perfection of generosity. 2 harm our willingness to give others material objects. 2 harm our willingness to give others protection from fearful situations. 2 involve not providing the circumstances for others to cultivate and practice generosity themselves. And then 1 harms our development of the generosity of giving teachings. And when we talk about the perfection of giving, there's 4 types of giving. 1 is giving material things. 1 is giving dharma. 1 is giving protection or fearlessness. And then sometimes we add the 4th one is giving loving kindness, providing loving kindness. Okay, so when we talk about generosity, it's not just material things. That's 1 kind of generosity, but also the dharma, fearlessness, and loving kindness. So the first one, and the way it's phrased in the original text, is not to offer the 3 to the 3. So the 3 refers to respect with body, speech, and mind to the 3 jewels every day, right? So we're supposed to do some physical reverence to the 3 jewels, like bow, prostrate, even to put your hands together like this, or to make offerings on an altar, right? So some physical show of respect. Verbally, to say a minimum of 4 lines, so to do that refuge and bodhicitta prayer that we do before each class fulfills that, right? Because we're paying respect verbally. And then mentally, recalling the excellent qualities of the 3 jewels and generating a sense of faith. Okay, so to represent the 3 jewels are the Buddha jewel, the Dharma jewel, the Sangha jewel, and to represent those, we have things on our altars, things like statues to represent the Buddha jewel. We have stupas to represent the enlightened mind of the Buddha, and also the Sangha jewel. We usually have text to represent the Dharma jewel. So setting up offerings before these representations of the 3 jewels, or, like I said, just saying a verse with your hands together in the prostration mudra and reciting the verse and mentally creating that kind of mind of respect. And if you don't do it because of some kind of anger or pride, it's considered to be breaking that vow in an afflicted way. And if you just don't do it out of laziness or indifference, or because you simply forget, you're doing it in an unafflicted way. Okay? So questions about that? Yeah.
On our altar at home, is it significant whether we have fresh flowers or silk flowers?
Yeah, I think silk flowers are fine. You know, it's kind of nice from time to time to offer something fresh, but then you have to really keep an eye on it, that it's not there forever and doesn't go kind of bad. One of the things with offering fresh flowers or fruit or food or anything like that The rule of thumb is don't offer anything on your altar that you wouldn't hand to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. So it's like if the flowers are getting a little bit wilty and funky, take them down. Like don't offer anything that you wouldn't offer directly to like an enlightened being. So as long as you kind of keep that in mind. But I think it's kind of nice too. I mean, I love, silk flower arrangements. I think those are really nice to offer. And then it's kind of nice to offer things that you offer kind of on a daily basis that you have to do, whether it's water bowls or whether a little food offering every day or something like that, because then you're actually offering, kind of every day. And then don't just kind of mindlessly fill the water bowls. Actually offer them mentally after you fill them up, because that's one of the things. I mean, it can just be like filling up a bunch of bowls of water and you walk away, but then you imagine kind of transforming them into the offerings and offer them. So really trying to do it with mindfulness is good. Yeah.
Are we still putting the pinch of orange in the water?
Yes. Yeah. There are people who come every morning for hours to do all of that here. It's really interesting living here because you see the whole Tibetan community and how involved they are. And every single morning on Friday, 4 amalas come and clean this house from top to bottom, and they're here all day long scrubbing and sweeping, and it's just amazing what happens here when it's not weeknights and weekends when you guys are here, and how much, and one person fills the water bowls, and then another person makes the saffron water and adds the saffron to it after the first person has done it, and then the second person makes all these incense offerings outside and stuff. So yeah, it all gets done here. Yeah. Anything else about offerings? Okay. So the second one, to allow improper thoughts of desire to go on. So thoughts of desire means you have a state of mind that's just never satisfied with what you have. Excessive sensual desires or attachment to gain or attachments to others praising you. So you have all of this longing for all of these things that you don't have. Just a mind of total discontentment. And what this is saying is try to stop that mind that always wants, a friend of mine calls it the anywhere but here kind of mind. Anything but what's happening now. I want more, I want better, I want different. This is really, really hard because this is like such a state of mind that we mostly have, is a mind of attachment and grasping and not being satisfied. But this is saying at least we try to stop following all of those desires when they arise in our mind. Stop that mind from just generating one desire after another. Even if we don't manage to succeed, at least the misdeed is a lot lighter than if we just let it go. So this vow is saying, you just let it go. You don't do anything to try and curb all of those desires. Even if you don't succeed, if you just do anything to try and curb it a little bit, then you've kept this vow. Because it is hard in our minds. We're always doing that, just grasping. But any effort at all to prevent it will prevent you from breaking this vow. And then the desire becomes really excessive, especially if you would do something non-virtuous to fulfill it. But this is just saying, just a mind that keeps churning out, oh, I want this, I want that, I want to go there, I want to buy that, just all the time, and you're not doing anything to try and control that mind at all. Okay? So, that one. Easy, right? Yeah, great. And then the next one, not respecting our elders. And in this case, elders are considered people who have taken vows, bodhisattva vows, lay vows, monastic vows, any kind of level of vows before you, no matter what their chronological age are. And they should be worthy of respect just because they're more experienced and knowledgeable than you are. And they can help you and instruct you. So again, this is something really cultural, that in Asian culture, respect for elders is just like such a big deal, right? Like you wouldn't even think to, talk before your elders, interrupt them, not serve them first, all of these things. And, in Western culture, this isn't really a value, that's prioritized at all. When I lived in Canada, we were just talking, Mary Jane and I were just talking about where I lived in central Canada, and there were a lot of Native American reserves there, and wow, the respect for the elders. Elders get served food first. That's why I check with my friend Judith. I mean, I have that so deeply. I would totally serve her before I ate, and then she was not eating. But that's why I check to say, like, are you eating? I mean, it's so ingrained, like elders always go first. So it's sort of that cultural thing, and I think it's really, I really like just kind of keeping that in mind and really like honoring and serving elders. And it's a way of keeping this vow too, even though we're saying not necessarily chronological elders, but often it is. Somebody who's senior to us in practice sometimes often is senior to us. And in the monastic protocol, at the time of Lord Buddha, he asked the monastics a question. He said, how should we decide kind of any kind of hierarchy in terms of the monastics? And then one person said, oh, about how many realizations do they have? And then another person said, no, it's about how much have they studied? And then another person like, oh no, if they have developed perfect samadhi in this wonderful single-pointed concentration. And then another person said, it should just be seniority. When were they ordained? And then Lord Buddha said, yeah, that's unambiguous. Let's stick to that one. So always in, when there's a group of monastics, our sitting order, our eating order, everything is done in terms of our date of ordination. And sometimes when I'm at a center as a visiting teacher, sometimes the organizers, if they're lay people, want to serve me first out of respect because I'm the visiting teacher. But if there's senior monastics there, like there's no way I'm going to eat before them. I'm going to keep to the monastic protocol because that's sort of a hierarchy of seniority. So that's what this one is talking about. And the way this relates to the practice of generosity is if we're serving people, and especially thinking if they are older than us, if we serve them, it's a way of offering protection. Like my friend Judith and I were circumambulating, and she, not so mobile, she walks with a cane, and then she grabs my arm so we can walk along and I can help her steady herself. And that's just a respectful thing to do, to offer service, especially if they are elders, to kind of protect them and offer them service so it makes things easier for them. So that's how it really relates to generosity. So any questions about that one? That one's pretty straightforward. And the next one, not answering questions that are sincerely asked. And this means not answering a question or giving an inadequate answer to any question. It doesn't even need to be a Dharma question. Even a question like, how are you doing, if it's asked sincerely. So if you don't answer because you're angry, spiteful, or proud, you commit an afflicted offense. If you don't answer because you're lazy, forgetful, or tired, it's an unafflicted offense. And the way this relates to generosity, it's not only the generosity of giving a Dharma, answer, but it also leaves the person confused with no one to turn to. So it's sort of an unsafe situation. They're confused. So it's a way of offering protection. And the proper way to answer is whatever is appropriate to the situation. Now, the question needs to be sincerely asked. Remember the example I just gave before the break of the guy next to me on the plane who just wanted me to entertain him with the Four Noble Truths for a 14-hour plane ride. And I'm like, dude, you'll get bored within 5 seconds if you're not really interested. So it needs to be sincerely asked. Now, there's some exceptions to this vow when you're off the hook for not doing it. If you're sick, if you're asleep or groggy, if you're teaching and the question interrupts the flow, if you're listening to a teaching, or if you want to somehow teach the person a lesson, but with a compassionate motivation. So you don't answer their question because you're trying to teach them a lesson. And that happened last night. This woman asked a question about the Pali text, and I thought, okay, we're getting all off into this whole other thing, and I really want to finish. So I just said, let's get back to the Bodhisattva vows. So I didn't answer her question. It was a sincere question, but I thought, okay, I've got to rein it in a little bit. We're getting a little too far, afield, and hopefully I did it in a kind way, but it was just kind of like, okay, it's interrupting the flow of what I want to be talking about. We're getting a little, far out there. So sometimes that happens. So these are some of the exceptions that it's not a fault if you don't answer a sincerely asked question with one of these exceptions. But otherwise, somebody asks you, even if it's something mundane, just being kind to people and just being approachable and so forth is, I've noticed that in Boston. I think people in California are friendlier. I walk around the neighborhood a lot just for exercise, and I'll meet people, and sometimes they look away. Sometimes they'll say hi, but then I'll just be like, hey, how's it going? Not one person has answered my second thing. They'll just say hi and keep walking, even if I say something else. And I was like, wow, in California, they totally say, I'm doing great, how about you, yada, yada, yada. So I think it's funny that, cultural. The next one, not to accept a sincere invitation. And this one refers, originally to the monastic community. And remember also before the break I said, there's a thing of accepting what people offer you because you're a representation of the three jewels. So it's virtuous for people to make offerings to you when you're a monk or a nun, like the lady in the gas station who was dying to offer me something and comes out with this monster coffee, even though I just had a much better one up the street, but I accepted, right? So it's the same with invitations. And so the original thing was, often in the time of Lord Buddha especially, lay people would offer the monastics to the meal, the noon meal, which was the main meal. They would, because they would want to make an offering and create merit by the invitation. So if they refused the invitation out of a bad motivation like anger, wanting to hurt the person's feelings, or pride, not wanting to be seen with those people, it was an afflicted offense. If they didn't accept out of laziness, it's an unafflicted offense. So that the kind of the thinking behind this one is you're some kind of an object of merit to other people that want to make an offering to you. They invite you somewhere out of that motivation. Now the exceptions are, if you're sick, you've accepted another invitation already. To accept means that it's too far or too dangerous to go. You're invited out of a bad motivation, or if it diverts you from a virtuous act, right? That would be when you're, allowed to refuse the invitation. When I was first studying the Bodhisattva Vows, I was a lay person at the time, and I remember a friend and I were going through this thing that a lot of people go through when they get interested in a spiritual path or get interested in Dharma. You become kind of less interested in things like parties and going out for brunch and all these things that feel more and more like a bit of a waste of time. So I remember my friend and I went to our teacher, and we were kind of in a conundrum going, oh my God, does that mean we have to accept every invitation to kind of go hang out with people? Because that's not really what we want to be doing anymore. And he said, no, it's okay. It's really about other people's opportunities. He goes, if by accepting all these other invitations, you feel like you're really wasting your time, or you might be in a bar or something and it wouldn't be so great for your mind and you create more non-virtue. So it's really more specifically about somebody really sincerely offering to you because they want to offer you something, and you just sort of, don't accept the invitation. So questions? Yeah, Karen.
Married and your spouse wants to go to a party, but you want to go to a Dharma teaching?
Yeah. What do you do about that?
I think I gauge how much he wants to go and how upset he would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the only clue I have.
And I think that's best, really about, you have to compromise, don't you? When in any kind of relationship, you really have to compromise, but you don't want to always be the one compromising. You want to kind of meet both ends to the middle, at a certain point. But that is one of the struggles often that people go through when they get interested in Dharma. Isn't it? Like those of you might have already been through that. Like suddenly your life is kind of changing, your priorities, the stuff you want to do, the stuff you want to talk about. And it can be really hard, and it can also be isolating. Like that's why it's so great to have places like this where you know each other. Because especially if you're the only one that you know that starts to get interested in this stuff, or with your partner, your spouse, it can be a little bit, difficult. You were raising your hand, are you having that experience?
Couldn't come yesterday, right? Because I went home for dinner and I failed to tell Tom that
We're gonna
go for this weekend. He said, I thought it was last weekend that you were interested. I didn't know, but I'm really interested in this.
Yeah.
Bodhisattva vows.
Yeah.
Got a little bit touchy.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, because there you are, and you have a young son, and then for 2 weekends in a row, he has to take care of everything at home because you're here. It can create conflict for sure. So I think we have to, like Karen said, really gauge how important is it? How important is it to the relationship that I'm gonna, compromise maybe what I want to do and just kind of go along with what the other person wants to do, and it's not easy. Yeah.
I mean, it's like, I have those kind of challenges that kids and family, husband at home. And I think further to that, it took a while for me to finally come to this state to realize it's also to try to think, if we try to think in terms of if it causes them to be, to have affliction.
Yeah.
If what we're doing, even though we want it very much for ourselves, but if we cause them to be angry or to hate Buddhism.
Well, that's especially true, isn't it? Yeah, exactly.
It's not.
Yeah, that's right. And that's so huge, like to, if your partner starts to resent and be angry at Buddhism, wow, that's a bad imprint. I mean, much better than they're mad at you. Not great, but yeah, exactly. Engaging, where is that? And it's tough, right? Because it can change from moment to moment too. And, for those of you that are in relationships, I mean, I'm completely off the hook. It's so great, And it's one of the reasons that Buddha designed this lifestyle with a celibacy vow is, we don't have those other priorities in life. It's easier to just reprioritize. Not that it's still not challenging, but so much easier. And it's just as a lifestyle choice. But it is hard. It is a dance, and you might find in your own life you err a little bit too far in one direction or the other as you're trying to kind of gauge it and get the balance right. I mean, you might have to stay home now for 6 months, because you had 2 weekends in a row. You might have bargaining.
Bodhisattva, aren't they all testing that, learning to be perfect?
Wow, right. Yeah.
Oh, maybe you should go, Tom.
No, don't go there. Yeah.
I feel like I can chime on this too, because I literally had this issue last night. Like, my girlfriend actually got upset with me because I was here all last weekend. And
Right.
she's like, well, I haven't been seeing you, and we both work during the week, and I'm like, I work too, but I feel impelled to go. Like, there's something, it's like I have to, like, it's
Yeah.
I just didn't know what to say to her other than the fact that, like, I feel impelled to go. I don't know what to say.
Right.
I feel like I have to do it. Like, it's.
And then sometimes, like, what people do is really negotiate real quality time and just go, babe, I've got to do this thing this weekend, and next weekend we'll go to Vermont to see the fall colors.
That's what I told her. This weekend now, because we're leaving after this weekend. I was like, and then, but I have to do it. Like, I have to. I don't know what to do in that situation. She, like, literally got upset with me. Like, tears in her eyes. She's upset. Like, that I, wasn't around. But.
I mean, sometimes I think if you do promise some, like, super quality thing to make up for it, it can really help. It's like negotiating. Just go, I've been thinking about it, and I really miss you too. Like, that really helps, I really miss, I know, we haven't spent time together. Let's go away next weekend, That'll work. Yeah, relationship advice from the nun. Sorry. See how well that worked out for me. Sorry. I had one student in Canada. He was so hilarious, this older man. And at one point I can't even remember how it came up, and he just goes, oh, well, you're a nun. What on earth do you know about relationships? And I was like, I didn't get ordained till I was 46 years old. You don't think I didn't have plenty of experience under my, it was that kind of like, oh, wow. You know, it's so funny, people sometimes think you were just like born a nun, you know, and you just kind of like born from the middle of a lotus already with a shaved head. It was like, no, not at all. I was talking to a monk friend and we were laughing about that. This guy, like, so sure, he's like, well, what the hell do you know about relationships anyway? You're a nun. And I was like, yo, not always been a nun forever. But yeah, but it is hard. It's hard. Sometimes I think in Dharma centers, I often joke and I say, I think there need to be like renunciation support groups, like for people going through this thing of like, what works for you? And then Karen could say, oh, you know, just gauging how important it is. You know, oh, I don't want to watch TV anymore, but I want to be with my partner, but I can't stand just sitting in front of the TV, so what do I do? And do I go in there with the book? You know, there's all these questions that come up for people, and I think sharing what seems to work or just how do you navigate this territory, I think can be really helpful to do. Yeah. All right. Because I was 46 years old before by the time I got ordained. No, I remember the TV. I used to visit my dad when he was still alive, and he was just one of those people that would park it from the 6 o'clock news to the 11 o'clock news, and that was every night. That's just kind of what happened. So here I am visiting my father. We're not going to talk during this 5-hour period because we've got to be watching television. So it was this struggle too of like, well, I want to hang out with them. I don't want to just be in another room. So I just bring in a book, and then of course I get totally sucked in. You know, I'd be reading my book and then just like horrified fascination at whatever was going on. Because that's another one. It just is like such a time waster, and then you're like, I don't even want all the stuff that's in there, the imprints in your mind, and then sometimes there's horrible violence. Like with my dad, I'd be reading my book, and then I'd look up, and there'd be some horrible violent thing, and I just go, and he'd be like, what? You know, he's so desensitized to it. Oh, just horrible. And that's what?
I didn't say anything, but I was thinking, TV's gotten very violent.
Yeah. I mean, when I was a kid, it was like, you know, a horse is a horse, a course is a course. No one can talk to a horse, of course. I mean, it was so benign. It was like, Leave It to Beaver and like Mr. Ed and the Brady Bunch, you know, and then suddenly it's turned into a full-scale slaughter and sexual misconduct. And I'm like, when did that happen? You know? I would say that you sit down to do a long meditation retreat and like you can't remember any prayers in Tibetan, but a horse is a horse, a course, a course. No one can. It's all in there. Sorry, you don't, that's a cultural reference that you don't know. Yeah.
I feel like I experienced this like 2 nights ago too, because my girlfriend's brother and his girlfriend, they watch Criminal Minds on TV, and they're like,
oh, that's
crazy.
Oh,
and they're like,
God.
but they love it, and that's when it hit me, like, wow, these, like, they love watching this show because of how twisted it is, and like, there's something like, it hit me, like, how deeply, like, that.
It makes such an imprint, yeah.
It just really hit me, and I was like, wow, that's.
I remember
so much, like the twistedness and
the twistedness
stuff, the imprints that are left on your mind stream. It's such a shame.
I had a friend who watched all those cop shows. Like she was really into watching all these shows. And then you could see in her mind, her mind always went to the worst case scenario, like the most paranoid place. Like I was gone and she was looking after my car, and then she emails me, I'm in India or something, and she's like, oh, somebody broke the window of your car. And I'm like, really? In front of the Buddhist center, somebody would break the window? Like, whatever. And she's like, can I take it and fix it? And I'm like, yeah, sure, the insurance is here, whatever. Then I get back, and hers was like, I called RCMP, the cops in Canada. I called them, and we filed a report because somebody broke the window. I get back, come to find out, the day the window was broken, the kid we used to get to mow the front lawn was mowing the lawn, and there was all this gravel. Because she goes, nothing was stolen. And I'm kind of like, why did your mind go to someone broke the window? Scott was mowing the lawn, and a piece of gravel, you know, broke the window. It's so obvious to me that that's what happened. But I think because of the imprint of all these crazy border patrol and canine whatever, and Yeah, all of this, like her mind just immediately went to the most paranoid. Somebody came along with a baseball bat. It's like, no, the guy was mowing the lawn and kicked up a rock into my window. So, yeah, and that's another thing. Just keeping, like, watching the things that we expose ourselves to. You know, our mind is very precious real estate, you know, and when especially you get interested in Buddhism and you go, all of those imprints you're going to be taking into the next life. What kind of imprints do you want on your mind for the next life? Now, we need to hang out with our friends. Like I said before, you're just not going to be talking about the Four Noble Truths all the time. You know, you need to kind of hang out and do these other things. But it's about how much time are you spending filling your mind with all of these things that might be quite negative, and can you reprioritize and maybe, even if you're watching TV, watch some documentaries, watch some nature channel, don't watch the cop shows. You know, look at the effect in your mind, because I notice if I expose to that kind of stuff, it's in there, you know, and it changes the way that I'm perceiving things. So I think these are some of the real life choices that we really need to make in our lives, you know. It's not always easy. Yeah, television, oh, God. Okay. The next one, number 6. Similar to the one about the invitation, not accepting money, gifts, and so on when they're sincerely offered. And again, this is a sponsor, you know, a benefactor trying to offer to you. If you refuse out of anger or pride, it's an afflicted offense. Out of laziness, it's an unafflicted offense. And then there's some exceptions to this one too. And again, remember, this is more for kind of the monastics that we're supposed to have, you know, limited possessions and just not have a lot of stuff. The exceptions, if you know you'd get attached to the thing, you know the person that's giving it to you would later regret it. And sometimes this happens too. People get caught up in the moment. You've given a great teaching, you know, and they want to give you some like huge offering or something, but you know it's just like the moment and that they might regret it later. If you think that the thing is stolen, if it would hurt the person financially, okay, in which case then if you refuse it, instead of getting an offense, you actually create great virtue. Or if it would be some kind of a problem for you to have it. So all of these are exceptions. Otherwise, if someone is sincerely trying to offer something to you, and this is one of the ones like the one before, you allow others to practice generosity. Sometimes we get into this thing of, no, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. Even as monks and nuns, that's one of the things that's the hardest actually when we're newly ordained, to get used to accepting respect and offerings from other people. Right? Because we're like, oh, I'm just totally ordinary. No, it's okay, it's okay. But then you realize you're cheating other people out of the opportunity to get a lot of merit by practicing generosity. So you have to just, in all humility, accept. There was a nun, I remember a long time ago, long before I was ordained, I was at a meeting, and it was a meeting of FPMT center directors, and we have a couple of centers in Taiwan. And the director at that point was a Taiwanese nun, and she was talking through a translator, and somehow she was saying, I don't know, something about her attitude of being a nun and living in Taiwan or something, and she said, you know, often she said when she'd be going somewhere, the taxi driver would give her a ride and then offer, like at the end of the ride, just go, no. And then she said, you know, oh, sometimes I feel like, oh no, I don't deserve it. But then she goes, but I'm wearing the robes of Lord Buddha. That's what he's offering to. It's not about me and what my qualities are, but he's offering to the robes of Lord Buddha, so I accept it. And I remember that made a big impression on me. So that's kind of what this is talking about, mostly in terms of that, you know. One of the things that we're meant to, there's all this protocol around begging for offerings, and we're supposed to not pick the houses with the best cooks, right? We're just supposed to go from door to door to door. The only door that we're allowed to skip is a family that's very poor, but with so much devotion, you know that they would give you their last food, and then their family would go hungry. So those are the only doors that we're allowed to skip over, is if you know that out of devotion people would give you. So you're allowed to refuse if you know it would cause hardship for the people and that they would give you their own food or, what they really need themselves. Okay, any questions about that one? Yeah, so again, not so much that this will be happening for lay people, but it might be, that somebody is really practicing generosity with you. And, think about that too. I mean, you might not be the third jewel of refuge necessarily, but it is really helpful to kind of think about, allowing other people to practice generosity with you as the object. Now the next one, number 7, not to give the Dharma to a person who wants it. And in the root vow, the motivation is not giving Dharma out of attachment and not wishing to share it, because it's like, oh, somebody else will have the information that I have, I don't want to share it out of attachment. The motivation for this one is laziness, anger, or anything other than attachment. Okay, so it's a different motivation for this one. If you refuse out of anger, and it's an afflicted offense, out of laziness, it's an unafflicted offense. And the exceptions are if you're sick, if the student's waiting to criticize you or is disrespectful, if you know they can't understand the meaning, if you know that they'd freak out if you taught the subject. Remember my example of the guy who heard about bodhicitta and just freaked out. I didn't know that. If you don't believe they're interested in what you're teaching, if they have deep wrong views, if you feel like they wouldn't follow what you teach, the teaching would make them worse, or they'd spread that teaching to others who weren't ready. So all of those are exceptions. So again, it's about wisdom in terms of telling somebody about the Dharma. And you had that question about even not feeling like you even know enough to teach. I mean, that's an exception too. If you don't know the subject that they're asking about, or if you feel like they have any of these kind of wrong motivations for asking. Any questions about that one? Okay. Yeah, do you have a question? Oh, okay. I saw your hand go up. You're fiddling with your pen. Okay. I had a student in New Zealand, and he had a beard, and he was always kind of fondling his beard. And in my peripheral vision, I would just see this hand, and then I'd say, and he'd go, but he's always just sort of like going like that, and I'd always sort of see it out. So the next 9 vows are against the perfection of morality. So 4 concern situation in which our main consideration is others, 3 concern our own situation, and 2 concern both ourselves and others. So the next one is not to reach out to those who've broken their vows or done wrong deeds. So this is about not interacting with other people because they've broken their morality or because they've done some kind of wrong deed. So when we hear about people like this, instead of sort of shunning them, right, they're the people that need the most help. So we can't ignore them or forget about them. We can't reject taking care of people who, may have engaged in some sort of, wrong actions or bad morality. So not ignoring them due to anger, spite, laziness, indifference, or forgetfulness. And in Lama Tsongkhapa's commentary, he refers to cruel people, which means people who hardly practice ethics at all, any kind of ethics, and immoral people, meaning people who've broken some level of vows that they've taken, right? So we need to be careful not to ignore people like that. Now, the exceptions to that is, in order to subdue them, you don't take actions to help. If by waiting, the person would become more aware of their actions, and then it would be more helpful, or if by getting close to them, it would alienate a lot of other people, or when helping them somehow would be contrary to the rules of monastic behavior. So these are some of the exceptions. But other than that, when there are people, even if they've engaged in heavy wrong deeds and you feel that you could help them, we need to be able to help them. Okay. Some people say they have a lot of fear. You know, I've talked about my prison work, and I've talked to some people who go, oh, you know, that would be, wow, that's amazing, and that would be really amazing to do, but I'm actually just really, really scared, you know? So I think that it's not your intention to shun or reject, but some people really are intimidated by interacting with certain people that are quite heavy, you know, that have done these negative things. I sometimes take people into prison with me just so that they have a direct experience. I mean, talk about television. There's all of these like horrible made-for-TV movies and all of this weird stuff that gives people these crazy, isn't it, Marianne? I mean, these crazy ideas about what prison inmates, and I think when you have the experience and you see these like sincere guys just trying to turn their lives around, I've done that many times, taking people in with me, and for everybody it's just been, whoa, I wasn't expecting that at all, you know, just really, really different. So if somebody's very sincere about kind of trying to change. Karen, do you have a question? You're looking poised with something coming up in your mind. Am I right? Or is it just a...
No, you just mentioned fear, and I was searching my own brain to see if there was a
Question there about around the fear, because I think sometimes that's why I don't act.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of people, I had a student who's from Toronto, and she was talking about, I mentioned this, I think, last weekend. She said she really wanted to do something to help homeless people, but she was really scared. You know, she just felt like, well, gosh, half of them are kind of schizophrenic and the others are drug addicts, and I don't know, and it freaks me out. Like, she just kind of felt like, well, I have compassion, but they act erratically in a way that kind of scares me, you know. And then we talked about that, and I said, well, can you maybe donate to a shelter or do something in a controlled way? I'm not asking you to approach people on the street that it might feel quite unsafe, you know. So I think there are ways around it. Or like I said, you know, with some of the people that have done these wrong deeds, there might be a more safe way, you know, we can engage if we do feel like fear is holding us back.
For me, a lot of times, the fear plays into the not feeling like I would know how to do it.
Yeah.
So, not knowing how to do something creates fear in me.
Yeah.
And then if it's a situation I've never been in, or it's just, you know, I'm afraid of making a mistake,
Yeah,
then
that's
it
right.
all just seems overwhelming to me.
Yeah.
So finding that little bite that I can
That's
take
right,
is
yeah.
sometimes just doesn't end up happening.
And I think sometimes, like, figuring out what we're interested in terms of helping. I mean, this is such a big question, but, and then kind of finding mentors and people who've done it that you can kind of tag along and learn. You know, we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time either. And sometimes it almost feels like, oh, I need to find my thing and start a new nonprofit and do this thing. And there's ways that you can kind of like just get your toe in the door, start within your comfort zone, you know, helping or doing whatever service it is with somebody much more experienced than you, and then you kind of learn how to do it. So, you know, I think sometimes in our minds it's so extreme. It's either like, oh, I'm doing nothing, or I have to just do these really scary things that I have no idea what to do, whereas there's ways to kind of ease into it gradually also. Yeah. All right. So the next one, number 9, and there's 2 different interpretations for this one, and so we're going to talk about both of them. And the one in your book is a little bit different than the way when I was studying the Bodhisattva Vows. So I'm going to talk about my way, and then we'll look in the book. So the way that I heard this vow, and it might just be different commentaries or different translations or even different versions of the root text, I'm not sure the difference. When I studied this one, it was kind of framed as failing to follow the rules, which, if followed, inspire faith in other people. And this kind of relates to that consideration that we talked about before. So this is saying, you know, if you are a representative of Buddhism and you don't follow kind of the rules of ethics and morality, and then people would generate a wrong view about Buddhism because of it, don't do that. Okay, so that's what this one is talking about. We want people, because of, we want to be an example. We want to be a role model. We want people to generate faith in Buddhism because of us. And so we don't want to kind of compromise and cause other people to lose faith in the Buddhist and Buddhism. We have to be concerned about the impression that our behavior makes on others, and not to be so everybody will admire us and think we're so terrific, but just for how it reflects on Buddhism. Thupten Jinpa, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, one of his main translators, he says, his translation is, not observing the precepts of moral conduct because one wishes to ingratiate oneself with others. Okay, so that can be a way that we do that. Like, oh, they'll think I'm a goody two-shoes if I keep this morality. I don't want them to think I'm a goody-goody, so I'll just go along with the crowd kind of thing too. So we have to be careful about our morality because we are an example to people. And then in your booklet, it's a little bit different, not instilling faith in those who follow a path that's not your practice or your main interest. So we're supposed to support people even if they're interested in a path that's not necessarily our main interest. So refusing to give a requested teaching that you're qualified to teach just because that person's interests are different from yours. So that's a little bit different. And again, I'm not sure exactly where the difference of interpretation comes in. Sometimes there'll be slightly different versions of the Tibetan text, and it might be something like that. Any questions about that one? Okay. The next couple are intense. Do you need another little break before we get into the intensity? Are you good? Can you handle it? Okay. All right, bring it on. It's been easy up until now, but the next two. So, the next one, performing deeds which are only of lesser benefit for living beings. So in our rules of morality, we talk about natural non-virtues and proscribed non-virtues. So we say that natural non-virtues are those things that are non-virtuous for everyone, whether you've taken a vow to do it or not, right? So killing, stealing, we say for everybody. It doesn't matter whether you've taken a vow about it or not. It's naturally non-virtuous for everybody. Then there are certain rules that are proscribed rules that only if you've taken a vow to do that, to not do that thing, is it a problem for you. For example, for a lot of the monastic vows, for you guys, to wear jeans and a t-shirt, no problem at all. For me, part of my vow is to not look like a layperson and to wear monastic robes. For you, it would actually be a fault to wear monastic robes and pretend that you were a monastic, like the monks in Times Square, But for you, it's no problem to wear whatever you want. Whereas for me, because of taking that vow. So it's nothing that's naturally non-virtuous. It's just on the basis of having a vow. So bodhisattvas must keep vows very strictly. And we're told that if there's greater benefit, we can break one of the proscribed rules if for the greater good. Right? So if by keeping one of the lesser vows strictly would mean, that sentient beings weren't being served, were allowed to break a lesser vow. And I'll give you an example. This is an example from the scripture, and maybe we can think of a better example. So monastics, one of our vows is we can't keep possessions beyond the requisites. I mean, this is strictly speaking. Nowadays, we do it differently because we don't live in monasteries and we don't go in alms around. But the way the original vows were, we could only keep something that was offered to us, like bolts of cloth, for example, to make our robes. We had to make robes out of them within a certain period of time. We just couldn't store a bunch of cloth. We had to actually make robes and distribute them to the monastics. But let's say that you're a monastic and a lay person has offered you a bunch of cloth that you can use to make clothes for people that can benefit, but you can't make the clothes within the 30-day limit that you're allowed to keep them. So this is saying, forget about the 30-day limit. Don't not accept this offering that could be of great benefit to others just because you have to break the minutia of the little rule that's of lesser benefit, right? So it's about that. Now we have to be super, super careful about this because as we know, the human capacity for rationalization and justification is pretty infinite. This comes up with this vow and the next one too. But this is kind of saying, if you're a bodhisattva, monk or nun or lay person, because of course there's lesser vows for lay people too, you must, kind of overlook a lesser vow for the greater good. If it really is of great benefit to others, you do it, right? You do it. For example, fully ordained nuns, and I'm not fully ordained, I'm a novice because we don't have full ordination in the Tibetan tradition, are not allowed to travel without traveling along with another nun. And that's for protection, because in the time of Lord Buddha, for women to go around alone meant you were raped, and this happened all the time. Because if you're outside of the city limits of the village, there was no protection at all, and there were all these bandits and so forth. So one of our vows is not to go around alone. So a friend of mine, Thupten Chodron, this great teacher, she was talking about this vow once, and she goes, well, I'm invited to tour and teach all over the world. I don't want the benefactors to have to pay for 2 air tickets just so I keep my vow strictly and have another nun sitting next to me in coach on, United Airlines. She goes, as long as I'm in a public place, like an airport, I'm safe. There's police around. So the intent of that vow is about protection. I don't have to keep the letter of the law of the vow if it means that everybody inviting me to teach has to double their expenses and have twice the airfare. So she goes, I'm going to think about it in terms of my safety, and then for the greater good, travel alone. They pick me up at the airport like there's no problem. So that would be another example of that one. Okay, so thinking of that. And again, that bodhisattva sort of shape to your life of thinking of the greater good of all beings, and maybe not keeping so strictly to the minutia if it would override the greater benefit. And then the next one is also kind of interesting and tricky, and this one usually we have a lot of conversation about this one. If you don't break the first 7 vows of morality, when an extraordinary circumstance requires you break your bodhisattva vows. So one of the 7 negative actions, and those are out of the 10 non-virtues, the ones that have to do with the body and the speech. So when universal love and compassion deem it necessary in an extraordinary instance, one of your bodhisattva vows says you have to break one of the 7 non-virtues of body and speech. However, as you can imagine, there are a lot of caveats to this one, so we'll talk about that. Because of course, the 10 non-virtues are so general. Abandoning misdeeds is the basis of Buddhist morality. So this seems really nuts to us of like, wait, you're saying we have to break those vows? But if there's an overriding need and it's an exceptional circumstance. So some of the criteria is you need to be a really, really, really advanced practitioner. Your motivation is only love and compassion. There's not any self-serving motivation at all. You have enough insight to know breaking that vow is the only thing that will help in this situation, right? And you're willing to take the hit. Then you can do it. So again, extraordinary situations done by a great practitioner with, enough insight and wisdom to know it's the only thing to do, and you don't have a shred of self-cherishing motivation at all. So those are the conditions for this one. There's a couple of famous examples of when this was done. Can anybody remember an example? Yeah, tell the story.
Oh boy. Another, 100 500 people, that's even worse, right?
Yeah.
500 people on the boat, and Buddha was the captain, and there was someone who was going to, they had a lot of merchandise, a lot of goods, and this one person was intended to kill the 499 so that he could take the profit.
Yeah.
And Lord Buddha could see this.
Yeah. It was a past life of the Buddha, by the way. It was one of his past lives. So it wasn't when he was the Buddha, it was a past life.
Past
just a
life of the
detail.
Buddha. So I'm looking at your 4. He was an advanced practitioner. And he thought that, well, he didn't think there was anything else that could be done other than to kill the person who was planning to kill 199. He was willing to take the hit.
Yeah.
And
what was his motivation?
His motivation was to not only protect the 499, but to protect the person who was planning on killing from taking the hit of having killed those many.
So unbelievable compassion, knowing he would suffer, even though that deed was done out of such an altruistic motivation, and still it was a negative deed. So the altruistic motivation that he had, double altruism, saving 499 people, and saving the would-be murderer from the karma of killing 499 people. So incredible compassion, not one shred of self-cherishing. In fact, knowing that he would experience some result from that deed, was willing to do it. So that's the really, really well-known example of that. There's another example that comes from Tibetan history. Does anybody know this other kind of famous example? So there was a time long ago. So there was, and it might remind you when I start to tell the story. So a couple of hundred years, I think about 200 or 300 years after Buddhism began in Tibet with the great Indian master Padmasambhava, there was an anti-Buddhist king called King Longdharma, who was very anti-Buddhist and went around destroying a lot of the monasteries and killing a lot of the monks and nuns. I think there were some nuns at that point, mostly the monks, destroying the Dharma in Tibet. In fact, they say on our robes, mine's kind of faded, we have this little blue piping. And it was said that so many of the monastics were slaughtered in Tibet. In order to have an ordination, you need 5 fully ordained monks to have an ordination of monks. And they didn't even have 5 monks in Tibet, and they wanted to revive the tradition, and they had to go to China, the border region of China, and get fully ordained Chinese monks to revive the tradition. And the Chinese monks wore this sort of blue-gray color, and this little piping on our robe is supposed to be in gratitude to the Chinese monks that revived the monastic order in Tibet. But before that, while King Longdharma was still going on the rampage, a monk first gave back his vows and then killed King Longdharma for the same thing, to prevent him from destroying the Dharma and also prevent him from the karma of destroying the Dharma. Now, since the person that killed him had been a monk, and this is one of the conditions, and before you do one of these things that would be breaking your monastic vow, give your vows back. Then kill the anti-Buddhist king. And the monk that did that, there was a line of reincarnate lamas from that monk who actually killed. They said he was at a high enough level of realization when he killed the king, he was able to transfer his consciousness to a pure realm. And that's what's said to be, some of the commentaries say, that's one of the conditions too. If you're going to kill somebody, you need to be able to transfer their consciousness to a pure realm. So don't be going around killing people and saying, it's my Bodhisattva vow, right? So that's a pretty high level of realization. For something as heavy as actually killing a human being, that's one of the criteria. You have to be able to actually, have that transference of consciousness into a pure realm. But it's interesting, isn't it? I call this sometimes the Bodhisattva override. Of both of these last 2 vows are for the greater good. You know, we do things that actually are against, you know, not only the lesser vows, but even some heavier ones for the greater good if it's absolutely the only thing and the circumstances call for it. But we have to be super careful. Like I said, we all know, isn't it, that the human capacity for justifying and rationalizing and all of that business is just infinite. It's ridiculous. So don't do it lightly. Questions about that? Any questions? Okay. Wow, I thought there'd be a lot more. Yeah, I knew there'd be something.
Sharing us extreme last night on Facebook. Someone posted some killing of animal, lion. They were sick, but they were some people they would pay to kill these animals as a sport, but they're saying that because these people pay for it, it was a very poor country, they can take the money and donate it to the poor. And I still do not.
No.
I said no, that's not.
Yeah.
I would rather see them take the money, if they're compassionate, take the money and donate to carry the sick animal. That's what they think.
Well, yeah. So that's weird, you know. And the motivations again is like the motivation of the person killing the animal. We would say was, you know, according to Buddhism, would be total ignorance of this is okay to do, to kill an animal, and this is so-called fun. So that person, we would say, would definitely still get the negative karma of killing. And then the person kind of setting up that whole trade, right? So yeah, I don't think that would be, yeah. No, that would not be, yeah.
Another example for 11 would be when Shakyamuni asked, gave himself to a starving bear or starving tiger.
Tigress,
in order to save its life.
Yeah.
Even though he killed himself essentially in order to prevent it and bring the passion of
That's right.
Helping.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a place in Nepal that you can go where that happened. It's called Namo Buddha. And you can go on pilgrimage there, and there's the place where he kind of hurled himself over a cliff so that the tigress wouldn't get the negative karma of killing him, right? He threw himself over a cliff, and he was saving the tigress from also the negative karma of killing her cubs, because apparently she was going to eat her own 5 tiger cubs because she was so starving. So he was saving her, not only feeding her, but also saving her from the negative karma. So yeah, that would be another example. That story's super interesting because of who everybody is in that story. So who's the tigress in a future life? Do you guys remember? And this is interesting. Master Shantideva says, any connection you make with a bodhisattva at all, even if it's a negative connection, you still have a connection. Because the way that story goes, in the future lifetimes, oh, by the way, in that life, that being the bodhisattva had a brother. The brother is the future Maitreya Buddha. The brother went home and didn't sacrifice himself. The bodhisattva who's going to become the Buddha went back and sacrificed himself. So his compassion was even stronger than Maitreya's, the future Maitreya's. But the tigress was his foster mother, Mahapajapati, who is actually the first nun. And then the 5 tiger cubs was his first 5 disciples. So because of that karmic connection, in his lifetime as Lord Buddha, the tigress that he had that connection with became his foster mother, who was also his aunt, and she became the first nun. And then the first 5 disciples were the cubs that he offered his life to. So it's crazy, isn't it? And that story's in the Golden Light Sutra. So it's interesting. Yeah. Let's take another little break. We'll come back and we'll do a little bit more. And then we'll see how far we get today. We're doing great, actually. We're kind of cruising through. But let's take another just 10 minutes and then come back, and then we'll have our last sort of half hour, 45 minutes or so. on me and all of that. I usually run cool, but I haven't been this last week.
This is a hot center.
Yes. Hot, hot, hot. Sometimes I come in here before class and like open the back door and go, okay, cool breeze, come through. So we'll just do a couple more. I think what we'll do is maybe finish the ones that have to do with the perfection of ethics, and then we'll do the ones that relate to the perfection of patience tomorrow. So we'll just finish these last couple of ones today. All right, so we just had the ones about breaking the vows for the greater good, and then the next one, number 12, accepting things that have been acquired through wrong livelihood. And it can be either yourself or others engaging in the wrong livelihood. So one wrong livelihood is praising others to gain something for yourself. And we talked about this before. A couple of other vows kind of relate to this one, right? Flattering others in order to get something for yourself. And then hinting. And this one, when I was studying this one time, it was with an American geshe, and he said, "Oh, those chocolate chip cookies you baked yesterday were so delicious," like you're hinting. And we always laughed about that example, but it was sort of like, "Oh, that offering that you gave me last year was so helpful." Right? So we're not supposed to do stuff like that. You can express gratitude, but not in a way that's sort of like hinting, like, and you could do that again, and it would probably be just as useful this year as it was last year. Bribery, giving a small thing to receive a larger one. And this is kind of an interesting thing, and I've had to talk to people in Dharma centers about this a little bit. It's like, I don't know if nonprofits do this anymore. They would give you address labels to kind of guilt trip you into giving them a donation. Remember that? Do they still do that? Giving a small gift, and then you get all these nice address labels that you didn't want, you didn't ask for. There's probably a mistake on them somewhere, but you feel somehow guilt tripped into giving a donation. So we have to be careful about this. Now, if someone gives the Dharma Center a donation and you give them some kind of a thank you appreciation, but you got to be careful about that. Not to say, I think it's a little dodgy, I think, to do one of those things to say, for this amount of donation you get this, and for this amount of donation you get that, and for this little dodgy, I think. So I think for Dharma centers, considering this Bodhisattva vow, we have to be a little bit careful, because it could just be, trying to invoke a larger donation in exchange for a smaller gift. Harassment or extortion, pressuring somebody so that they feel that they have no choice. And then pretense or hypocrisy, and this is changing your usual actions to make a good impression on others so that they'll give you something. And that one came up before, right? Being pretentious and pretending to be so holy so that somebody will think you're a great, object of generosity and give you offerings, okay? So we shouldn't willingly accept something that we feel has been improperly acquired. So this is either us doing those things or accepting things that have been obtained through that kind of wrong livelihood. So it's not necessarily us doing it, but it could be somebody else doing it at all. And then the sutras describe 5 other kinds of wrong livelihood: dealing in weapons, dealing in alcohol, things like this, prostitution, dealing in prostitutes, like being a pimp of prostitutes. So those are all considered wrong livelihoods also. Now, the exception is if you're struggling to get out of it, but you're, need to feed your family or something like that, then it's said that you're not breaking the vow. So if some reason you get into one of these wrong livelihoods and you're trying to get out of it, but you can't get out of it yet, then it's said that you don't break the vow. Hopefully we won't have to feel compelled to get involved in one of these wrong livelihoods in order to survive. Now the next one is kind of interesting. We might have some discussion about this too. Being wild and frivolous. One of the texts says being primarily interested in entertainment, right? So this is about just spending all of your time, with entertainment, with hanging out, partying, music, all of this kind of stuff. Mostly being involved in things like this. And mostly because it's a complete waste of time. And the exceptions are if you're struggling to stop and you can't control yourself, to lead another person from a bad deed, to create a better environment for people, to gain their trust. One of the exceptions I really like, to attract people to Buddhism who wouldn't otherwise come, who are attracted to someone with a jolly, happy nature. But the problem is being primarily interested in all kinds of distracting activities and entertainment. And I think we have to be really careful these days also about media. I think this fall, in the original text they talk about like festivals and parades and all of this. And I think like Facebook and Wikipedia and the internet and all of these sites, we can waste a tremendous amount of time. And this, again, comes from nothing that is so terribly wrong with that, but this is somebody who's dedicated their life to being of benefit to other beings. And you're just wasting your time checking everybody's status on Facebook all day long, right? When you've said, I commit to becoming a Buddha for the benefit of others. Now, as Annette called out in her desperate plea last night, can we take a break? This will go down in Kurukulla Center history. That was so cute. Oh yeah, were you here for that, Marianne? Yeah. What? You want another cup of tea? It's like 8:45. That was hilarious. So yeah, we need a break, we need to rest, we need to revive. So this doesn't mean, and I think often for those of us that are raised in kind of Western culture, we can get this really weird sort of Protestant work ethic mentality. I blame John Calvin. I don't know if I'm fair in doing that. That like Calvinist, in order to be virtuous, you're just sort of like doggedly in like drudgery all the time. And it's not like that. It's not like that. So we need a balance, right? It doesn't mean going to that place of, I can never have fun and I can never watch that funny cat video on YouTube and I've just got to be like serious Dharma practitioner all the time. This is just judging for yourself. How much time are we wasting in these frivolous activities? And some of them could lead to non-virtue. One student last weekend was just kind of like, I need to meet my friends for coffee and not in the bar. And some of it's like that, is just judging for ourselves, especially those situations that being involved with them, we're going to be careless and heedless about our other morality. We might say or do things that are not so virtuous also, right? So that's kind of the point of this one. Is just time wasting and being involved in something that could lead to non-virtue. And again, when, it's serious when we've taken these Bodhisattva vows, we're really saying, this is kind of the shape and structure of my life is like enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. So just looking at how much time we spend with that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I'm surprised that playing sports is there, because I feel like for the well-being of my body,
Yeah.
if I go play tennis or if I go for a bike ride, I don't view it at all as being frivolous.
Yeah, and exercise, absolutely, for sure. Yeah. For exercise, the motivation is to keep fit and exercise, but like sitting in front of the television night and day when, the football season or whatever it is. I mean, that's kind of what it's talking about, being primarily interested in that as a distraction and a diversion. But for sure, and I think that's one of the things, too, that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is really trying to get the Tibetan monastics like healthier, you know, because mostly like in Tibet, you know, drinking butter tea and eating yak cheese and all of this and never like moving. I mean, we have that with Lama Zopa Rinpoche, trying to get him, because he's manifesting, you know, high blood pressure, diabetes, and trying to get him to take care of his body, like impossible. It's just so not on the radar for him. So for sure, to be healthy with the attitude that the healthier I am and the longer I live, the more I'll be able to benefit beings, yeah. Then it's not a distraction, it's just smart. But then you see people who just are into, you know, bodybuilding and having like this totally sculpted, and it just takes hours every day. You know, that extreme, it's just about the extreme. But you're absolutely right, to exercise and keep fit is just smart, you know. Yeah, any other questions about that one? Yes?
Retreat in North Carolina with Zopa Rinpoche.
Oh, yeah.
And for 2 weeks we all ate vegetarian or vegan.
Yeah.
And he talked often and repeatedly and continually. He's incredibly inspiring, even when he repeats himself.
Yeah.
About how we had to be thinking about the benefit of all beings and the merit that we could multiply and generate.
Yeah.
And so I think that also helped people to be inspired to care for their health.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example. Yeah, and he is so inspiring when he talks like that, and you just kind of feel like, wow, I can do it. You know, I can do these things that seemed really hard. Yeah, good. All right. Usually I got a lot more pushback with that one. You guys must be either tired or already very advanced in the path. Okay. Oh, pushback? No?
Interest. So
yeah.
I guess the key word is moderation, I guess.
Yeah,
it's not subjective, right? How much you feel like you're putting time into doing these kinds of activities.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And knowing, like we talked about, you know, with Annette's desperate plea last night, is like one of the Bodhisattva activities right there in the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life is knowing when you need to rest, you know, and that's really important, because I've seen this so much in sort of Protestant work ethic North America, when people push and push and push and push and push, and then their motivation for being in a center is just, they become completely burned out, kind of bitter and resentful, and then like you're not an inspiration to anybody. Nobody wants to be around someone like that, because there's this thing of like, I can never stop, and I have to go. And the smartest thing to do, maybe, I mean, I remember this one center where I was living in, I would teach a lot of 10-day courses, kind of one after another. And as you probably noticed, I expend a lot of energy when I teach. I'm up here, you know, so one 10-day course after another. And about every couple of months, I just hit a wall energetically. I would just like completely, and I would just spend the day in my PJs reading Harry Potter. And I had no problem with that whatsoever. It was like, in order to keep going, I knew when I'd hit a wall, you know, and then I got better about catching myself before I hit the wall, and like, instead of a whole day in my PJs reading Harry Potter, I would just do it little by little by little, of like, okay, I've done a lot today, I'll rest, I'll read, whatever. So it wouldn't be this all or nothing kind of thing. But I had no problem at all just kind of going, wow, okay, I did awesome. I've taught these great classes for a couple of months. Today, I just need to like sign off of any interaction, be in silence, just chillax for the day, because I've done a lot. You know, and I think it's gauging that and then being very unapologetic about it, because it was the tortoise and the hare thing a little bit for me. Was like, if I could, you know, then I can get back in the saddle. If I keep pushing now, I'm going to go to that stressed out, maxed out place. And Master Shantideva has a great litmus test for us in the Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life that's so beautiful. And he said, the litmus test is, have you lost your joy in virtue? If you're doing virtue with a joyful, if you're serving others and your mind is still joyful, go for it. If you've lost your joy, just put on the brakes and recover, rest, relax. To me, it's so obvious when I'm doing service out of, oh, I should, as my friend Venerable Tenzin Chogkyi says, we've got to stop shoulding ourselves, you know? And it's so good. If should is in the sentence at all, just stop. You know, because if it's out of that motivation of like, oh, I should go out and people pick up on that energy and they're like, God, that's a Buddhist? They're like completely fried and neurotic. I don't want to be around them at all. You can't be an inspiration to anyone. So I think it's that, like taking some of those things into consideration for gauging where is our limit. And you find your capacity increases all the time. I told you guys last weekend I had that conversation with Lama Zopa on the phone once, and he said, your capacity is increasing all the time. And what used to totally max me out now is like nothing, and an easy morning I can accomplish that. You know, so realizing that it's always going to be shifting as you keep practicing what you're able to take on board in a way that's joyful and energetic for you, but being really clear about the limit and being unapologetic about it and just being okay with it. Yeah, Karen.
Could do 2 months and only need 1 day.
Yeah, I know. You know, I thought it was a big realization that, like, if you just relax for an entire day, and I remember telling these friends of mine, and they're like, Tenzin Chogkyi, that's why God invented weekends. And I'm like, oh, right, you know. But yeah, you know, and now I do it. That was like when I was living a little bit more extremely and also quite a lot younger. Now I need, you know, to book it in a lot more than once every 2 months. Yeah. That's right. And I think being okay with that. Yeah.
What is that phenomenon that increases capacity over time? Like how is that?
It's kind of like working out at the gym. You know, I think we just get more used to it. I think as our, you know, it's just like this whole thing that Alex Burson talks about, the Bodhisattva shape to your life. As you get more habituated to that, as you realize more how much joy you get from serving others. You know, in the beginning, it's really a stretch because we're so habituated to self-cherishing. Any going outside of our comfort zone to help others just feels like such a big deal. You get more habituated to it. You realize how much joy you really get out of it. It just becomes so much more natural. So then our capacity to serve in a way that's really joyful, I think it's just the habituation through practice and through really getting the results of that. Like I gave the example of the day I spent doing this prison visit that was like this marathon prison visit with like no food at all. And I really need to eat like every couple of hours. Like I totally need to do that. I'm kind of hypoglycemic and it just isn't good if I go 12 hours without food. Like that's a disaster. But how I knew it was like so much service, I was willing to put up with the physical hardship. And my mind was still so happy because I really saw, wow, this is super beneficial. It's worth it. I can't do this every day by any means. I can't even do that once a week. Like I have to do my prison visits with enough room in between to recover just physically from those kind of days. But I think it's that. I think for me, and it's an interesting question because I haven't really explicitly said, but I think it's that. The more you do it, the more you habituate to that shift of perspective, to that bodhisattva shape to your life, the more second nature that becomes. And then you can just kind of do more and more like joyfully. But remember the litmus test of, is it joyful or not? Because that's super important, are we still able to do it with a joyful mind? Because if you're doing it with a bitter, resentful, I should be doing this mind, you are not benefiting anybody. I don't care what you're doing, because they pick up on that energy, and it's just no good at all. And I think we all can feel, and being the recipient of that energy from somebody else, you're like, no, it's okay, just don't bother. Like, I don't even want to be on the receiving end of that kind of energy. Yeah. Anything else about that one? Okay, let's do maybe just a couple more. This next one, number 14, misconceiving that bodhisattvas do not attempt to attain liberation and failing to view delusions as things to be eliminated. And there's a big misunderstanding in some Buddhist schools, and I've heard this in some other Buddhist traditions, to say, oh, bodhisattvas stay in samsara, right? They aren't trying to overcome the delusions and get liberated from samsara. They're just staying unenlightened in samsara. So it's a misunderstanding. Now, we've said that bodhisattvas, these beings that have bodhicitta, actually wish to attain enlightenment quickly to benefit beings, and then come back, keep coming back, right, in order to help others. Now, we say for beings who've overcome their karma and delusions, choosing to be reborn through the forces of your great compassion and your altruistic intention, not being forced into rebirth by karma and delusion, we say it's not samsara for them. And let's take the example of the 14th Dalai Lama. Let's say he's a Buddha or a very high-level bodhisattva. That's the way we think in the Tibetan tradition. We say he chose his rebirth. Actually, his rebirth, the compelling forces for his rebirth was compassion and altruism and bodhicitta, that he chose to take rebirth as Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama. The propelling forces for that rebirth was not karma and delusion. Therefore, it's not a samsaric rebirth for him. Even though he shows up, he takes the plane, he comes to teach us, he does all these things. But he's not in samsara because his mind is free of karma and delusion, right? So it's a wrong view to say, oh no, he chooses to stay in samsara, he chooses to stay not to be liberated. That's where that wrong view comes from, because we say that bodhisattvas then keep returning. So we say that bodhisattvas don't go into the solitary peace of nirvana, right? So even though they're liberated from samsaric rebirth, they keep choosing a compassionate altruistic rebirth, right? So they're not going into nirvana, but it doesn't mean they're staying in samsara either. There's a third option, which is enlightenment and then manifesting for the benefit of all. So if you say something different than that, if you have that wrong view, that bodhisattvas don't attempt at all to overcome their karma and delusion because they're very happy to stay in samsara. That just doesn't even make sense. Actually, with that bodhisattva intention, you're way more interested in getting free from samsara than anyone else is, and you try as quickly as possible to attain full enlightenment for the benefit of all beings, okay? So that's that one. I feel like a couple of people now just completely hit a wall with that last point, so I think we might stop there. Let's open it up and see if there's any questions coming up. We'll stop with, number 14, and we'll carry on tomorrow, because I feel like that's a lot to digest, and we've got still tomorrow to do the rest of the secondary vows, and then I want to talk a little bit more about how do we take the vows, what are some of the things about taking the vows, what are some of the characteristics that help us keep them. But is there anything else that's coming up for you from anything that we talked about today? Anything to clarify? Yeah.
I'm just curious how the discrepancy between the 18 root vows and the 46 branch vows, I guess, how was it decided that these ones are the root ones, and we're going to take these 46, I guess, were found later, I suppose, right?
Well, we're all, I think what it is that the 18 were kind of explicitly mentioned in various sutras by Lord Buddha in a way that was very, very explicit. I think the other 46, and I'm not 100% sure, but this is my guess just from the study that I've done, the 46 secondary vows were mentioned in kind of a more narrative way. So they weren't so much like, explicitly taught by the Buddha, but it's a little bit reading between the lines of things that he said in sutras and examples where he gave advices and things like that. I'm pretty sure that's kind of the difference between the 18. Because as we saw in the really scary flip chart page, now I won't go back to, is, in the sources, so we had the root vows, 5 through 17 coming from the Sutra of the Essence of Space, 18 coming from the Sutra of Skillful Means, 1 through 4 coming from the Avatamsaka Sutra. And then Master Asanga's Bodhisattva levels, this whole text that he wrote about Bodhisattva activity, in chapter 2 of that, he's talking about some of the other things that the Buddha said about Bodhisattva activity. And then Master Chandragomin took that verse, or that chapter from Bodhisattva levels, and then pulled out of that narrative the 46 secondary vows. So I think it's more like that. These are more directly referenced very explicitly by Lord Buddha in sutras, and so that's why those are considered primary, where the others is like reading through the lines and like a compilation of the different advices that Lord Buddha gave the rest of the 46. A little bit. Yeah, that's what I think, kind of like that. For considering the sources and some of the commentaries and things, it seems like that. Yeah, great question. Anything else? You guys completely exhausted, aren't you? Yeah, me too, kind of. But we did great today. Wow, just cruised through. So, yeah, so we'll just kind of leave it at that for today. Come back tomorrow at 10. We'll finish up the secondary vows. Some of these are a little bit easier to kind of go through, a little bit more straightforward. Some will require a little bit more discussion. So we'll finish up, see how we're doing with time. We might have some time for general question and answer, which we did a little bit of today. We kind of wove it into the day, so that's quite nice. So let's get our dedication verses. And I think that's page 57. Yeah, 57 for our dedication prayers for today. And so let's just take a minute to reflect on what we've done today and to think. We've gone through all 18 of the root Bodhisattva vows and about a third of the secondary vows. So even being exposed to these training guidelines maybe has given you a different perspective on virtue and non-virtue, on what we can do to keep that bodhisattva shape to our lives. And it's incredible. So few human beings on the planet have the opportunity to be exposed to these ideas that might inspire us, even if we don't take the Bodhisattva vows from the teachings that we've had today. When those situations come up, we might be very inspired in our practice. So think about all of the virtue that we've generated, and you've paid attention. It's been a long day with lots and lots of detail. So think about all of the amazing virtue that you've generated through your attentiveness today to this topic. And just the power of bodhicitta, as we said yesterday, so virtuous, even generating a sense of admiration for this altruistic intention, just so powerful. So let's dedicate the positive energy. Through this virtue, may I swiftly, having gained Guru Buddha's state, place each and every sentient being without exception in that state. Precious, supreme Bodhi mind, may it where unborn arise, and where born never decline, but increase forevermore. And do we have long life prayers in here? 54. Okay, let's do the long life prayers. What is it, 42? 43. So at the bottom of page 43, we'll do the long life prayer for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And we can chant this in Tibetan. It's got a nice tune. Gangri rawe korwe shinkam dear pendang dewa malu jungwe ne chenre zigwang tenzin gyatso yi shape Site Bardo Tengyur Chig. And then we'll do the prayer that spontaneously fulfills all wishes. We can do this in English. Savior of the snowland teachings and transmigratory beings, who extensively clarifies the path that unifies emptiness and compassion, to the lotus in the hand, Lord Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be fulfilled. Yeah, let's turn to that one. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplishes magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Great, thank you so much. See you in the morning. Sleep well. You can watch TV tonight. You did great. You have the papal dispensation to indulge in entertainment tonight. Yeah, I know. No, not on Saturday. Yeah. Well. Oh God, I don't even think I need to know what that means.